a quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Morgan Burgess, is the Special Collections Librarian at the University of Newcastle Library. She was awarded her doctorate by UNSW for her research investigating fictional representations of the campaigns for women's voting rights in Australia and New Zealand. More recently, Morgan has become interested in the works of Australian writer Eleanor Dark and has a publication about her forthcoming. She has worked in university libraries and at the National Library of Australia and enjoys connecting people with Australia's literary history. And her paper today falls very much into that vein and is titled From Pen to Press, Australian Women's Bookcraft in the University of Newcastle's Special Collections. Morgan, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sasha. Good morning, everyone in the room and everyone online. Thank you for coming along to today's History at Newcastle seminar. I'm really excited to be here with you, and I hope that we'll have a really interesting discussion together. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the fact that I am speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Awabakal people and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia. I'd like to also pay my particular respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my talk today feels a little bit unusual for me because it's based on my experiences predominantly instead of some exhaustive research. So it doesn't really have a clear argument. It's kind of more of a series of reflections and some ideas for further thinking, I think. And actually I'm really interested to hear from you guys if you've got any guidance for me in terms of shaping my ideas as they're forming. So my talk is really about the process of putting together, of curating the exhibition that's currently on display at the Special Collections exhibition space at the library here at the University of Newcastle. It's called From Pen to Press, Australian Women's Bookcraft in the University of Newcastle Special Collections. And that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about today and how I came to the desire to create an exhibition on that theme, but also then what the process was like and what I discovered in that process about the collection and also kind of collection practices. So first of all, I'll outline what brought me to curating this exhibition, namely my PhD in literary studies, but then also the influence of starting my role in special collections as the Special Collections Librarian in January last year, and then needing to develop a strong understanding of the rare book collection holdings and taking responsibility for the object-based learning program here at the university. Then I'll discuss the exhibition itself and the women whose bookcraft is featured and the challenges I encountered along the way, but also kind of loosely consider the challenges that they faced being engaged in bookmaking in what's traditionally and continues to be a male-dominated industry. And finally, I'll consider how historic collecting practices have contributed to shape the collection as it exists now, noting the issues represented there are not unique to this collection. So what I'm finding is not about this collection particularly. This is just really a case study that kind of draws these kind of issues to the fore. And then I'll think about how the lessons learnt from my experiences can help to inform book collecting practices into the future. And I'm in a really unique position in that sense because I actually do contribute to the development of the Rare Book collection here. which is quite an exciting responsibility to have. So to begin with, I thought it would be useful to contextualise my particular interest in women's contributions to the book trade in Australia. And I'm sorry, I'm finding it difficult to manage the online and the in the room. So if I'm looking in strange directions, that's what's going on. Thanks to you. In some ways, it's a natural, my interest in women's contributions to the book trade is a natural progression from my doctoral research in Australian literary studies, for which my focus was the representation of the campaigns for women's voting rights in Australia and New Zealand in locally produced fictions. And that sentence is the really beautiful, pithy little line that, you know, came out of all of those years of research. I was interested in contemporary representations. So I was looking at literature published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries predominantly. And it wasn't exclusively women writers who interrogated the question of voting womanhood in fiction. But as votes for women were considered an issue that would most profoundly impact women, and I would argue that actually they probably was. And as writing fiction at that time in history was one of the few ways that women could insert their ideas into public discourse, the proportion of women writers writing about votes for women was very high. I was interested to discover if, first of all, a literary component of the fight for women's enfranchisement existed in Australia and New Zealand, which are both places where white women were enfranchised early in comparison with other nations, comparable nations across the globe. And secondly, once I discovered that just such a literature was being produced, I was interested to find out whether the literature's fictionality had any particular bearing on the way votes for women was represented. And I ultimately found that the literary genre or mode in which a writer chose to compose their fiction was often related to the kind of story that they were trying to tell. So realist fiction, for example, most often represented the challenges women faced as disenfranchised citizens. So namely the incapacity to shape the laws by which they lived, which could leave them vulnerable to domestic abuse or exploitation. Romance fiction, on the other hand, considered the implications of politically active women for heterosexual relationships, mostly heterosexual relationships. So there was some very interesting queer literature happening as well. And whether traditional family structures could persist with, you know, a world in which women could vote. While speculative fiction imagined how society might be fundamentally transformed by women's enfranchisement. So because of all of this research, I was already plugged in to discourse about Australian women's writing and thinking about the intersection of politics, gender and fiction. When I came to my role as Special Collections Librarian here at the University of Newcastle in January 2023, I started to consider books from a slightly different perspective. In my role, I'm responsible for the maintenance and development of the library's rare book collection. I'm also responsible for sharing the collection with students and researchers, or whoever might be interested in it for that matter. It's not exclusively, doesn't exclusively exist for researchers and students. In order to do my job well, I need to have a strong understanding of the rare book collection's strengths and weaknesses across areas like subject matter, format, date range, as well as its representation of gender, race, language, LGBTQAI+, peoples and also concepts and ideas, and disability and other diversity markers. Knowing these things about the collection can help me to strategically grow it when funding allows, but it can also assist me to connect researchers and students with material that will help inform their studies. So to help me develop an appropriately deep understanding of the rare book collection, I began a project last year called the Rare Book Collection Review, and I have to acknowledge that this is an ongoing project, and I think it's one of those things that just kind of carries on forever, which aims to use the metadata from the library's catalogue that describes each item in the rare book collection to develop a sort of map of the collection that touches on all these kind of points of diversity. I'll come back to the Rare Book Collection Review in due course. So we'll put that on hold because when I started working as the Special Collections Librarian, I didn't have the luxury of first becoming closely acquainted with the collection and then beginning to work by connecting people with its contents. So instead, I had to rely heavily on my colleagues' expert knowledge of the collection while working to maintain special collections service delivery, including reading room appointments and object-based learning programs, which is a big component of my role. So object-based learning programs are one of the most significant ways in which I facilitate particularly students' interaction with rare books. So the object-based learning program is really directed at students, but I do use some of the tools that I help students to engage with books in other settings as well. According to Helen Chatterjee and Leonie Hannon in their book, Engaging the Senses, Object-Based Learning in Higher Education, object-based learning is the active integration of objects into the learning environment. Object-based learning, they suggest, leverages an experiential, kinesthetic pedagogical approach, which is a whole lot of big words, that engages multiple senses. It therefore taps into a range of learning styles and appeals to different intelligences, making it a useful tool for engaging and meeting the needs of a variety of students at the same time. Object-based learning can help students develop their creative thinking and observational skills, as well as building their capacity for critical thinking and the development of evidence-based arguments. It also assists to develop empathy because it opens space for kind of self-guided and mutual learning that can contribute to learning outcomes and so-called soft skills for disciplines from the humanities to engineering, medicine and science. So it's really applicable, I think, across every discipline. But I also acknowledge that it's easier, I think, for those of us who work in humanities to, first of all, recognise the value of rare books and special collections because it's just, we work with them day to day. But also often the content of that material is easy to align with the kinds of research that's happening in the humanities space. Having said that though, with the development of soft skills, the content doesn't actually need to relate to the subject matter of the course in any way. It's just, it can help students to see why they're there, if what they're looking at appears transparently to relate to what they're studying. So object-based learning works by asking students to consider the materiality of objects, make observations about them, and use those observations to interpret meaning from the object. They're also able to identify where more information or the consultation of secondary sources might help to inform their interpretations. Chatterjee and Hannon suggest object-based learning works best when students are guided to understand how the items they're handling connect to or can help them develop skills relevant to their studies. So I like to think sometimes about medicine, and we don't actually have a program for students in medicine to come to do object-based learning at this stage. But thinking about future doctors and needing to have the capacity to build evidence, to then diagnose somebody and use all their observational skills to be able to do that, I think object-based learning has a really, can have a profound impact on their capacity to grow those skills, soft skills. Some anecdotal evidence from research Paige Wright, manager special collections, and I have recently done also suggests that object-based learning can be particularly beneficial for facilitating the discussion and analysis of complex and challenging issues, such as race relations and colonialism, for example, in a way that promotes safety, because teachers with lived experience of trauma and racism can use objects as the medium for learning without putting themselves and their experiences on the line. So in instances like that, the objects can work as an intermediary for students to learn from, rather than, as I say, asking a human to put their experiences on the line. While object-based learning has traditionally made use of museum and gallery collections as teaching tools, the materiality of which is often easier to grasp than the materiality of objects like books, books can be particularly thought-provoking material objects. And the reason that they're a little bit more challenging to consider as objects is that they're also containers of information. So considering their materiality doesn't come naturally necessarily, because even the conventions of books presentation can be hard to recognise because we're so familiar with that technology. And that's one of the things that I like to do with students is show them very early books where those structures for where to find the title of the piece and where to find the contents page and author information, none of that's structured yet. So that's a nice way of kind of disrupting that idea of books as only being containers of information. The materials, I've already mentioned that the materials that students engage with in object-based learning might be thematically related to their studies, but they don't actually have to be, because it's the book as a physical object where histories are encoded that's important for object-based learning. So thinking about books as material objects got me thinking more about all the people involved in creating a book, and particularly Robert. Oh, I have slides. I apologise. Here we go. You don't just have to look at my first. This one I meant to show you in relation to my PhD work. I absolutely love this banner. It was carried by a contingent of Australian women who went to agitate on the global stage in London in 1908. So once Australian women had the vote, and they took this off with them. And it's got an amazing story of rediscovery. It was kind of lost in the Parliament House art collection for many years, and then rediscovered. I think it might have been in the 80s as part of that kind of rediscovering women's stories. But it's gorgeous. I haven't seen it in person. I've only ever seen the reproduction. And here we go. Thinking about books as material objects got me thinking about all of those people that are involved at each point of the creation of books as objects, which is illustrated by Robert Danton's communications circuit. So it was really thinking in these terms with, my existing interest in women writers, and then coming to all of these new ideas about object-based learning and the materiality of objects that inspired me to put together Pen to Press. I didn't really have a clear theoretical basis for my approach to Pen to Press, but I was, I think, influenced by the kinds of ideas that underpin literary sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's ideas about cultural capital, which I first encountered through Susan Sheridan's work, 9 Lives Post-War Women Writers Making Their Mark. She published that, I think, in 2011. In that book, Sheridan reminds us that, quote, not all women are equally excluded from the exercise of cultural power, end quote. Women have experienced, she continues, and I quote again, varying degrees of visibility in the worlds of cultural production, at least over the past 200 years, end quote. This degree of visibility is informed by the interactions of their race, gender, and sexuality, class, and other social structures of power. By, in other words, their capacity to access cultural capital. Cultural capital can be intellectual and therefore linked to one's education, social or to do with one's connections with other people, or symbolic, which comes in the form of things like, as Sheridan describes, recognition, influence, and authority. So with these things in mind, when I approached the rare book collection thinking about locating works by women to feature in an exhibition, I was prepared to find fewer women writers, fewer women makers, fewer women of colour, fewer people with gender diverse groups, fewer people with who identify as homosexual or other than heterosexual. What I hadn't considered, however, is that by exclusively using the University of Newcastle's rare book collection, and actually I think that this kind of blind spot, I came to it with this kind of blind spot because of my PhD research, where I was drawing on collections from all over the country and actually all over the world. But by exclusively using the University of Newcastle's rare book collection to curate pen to press, these invisibilities that Sheridan references are overlaid and amplified by the limitations of collecting practices, which have historically been informed by the same kinds of mechanisms that limit women's access to cultural capital. Namely, a preference for works by men, often for 20th century writers at least, first editions in mint condition that don't have any marginalia or signs of use, and other kinds of collecting preferences. So I guess that's where I came to ideas about what I would expect when I entered the collection. I did, however, know that I wanted to make the exhibition an experience for its audience not too similar to the kind of experience students might have in an object-based learning class, by encouraging them to consider the book as an object, not just as a container for knowledge. In order to get the audience thinking about the book as an object, I wanted the exhibition to follow the path a book might take from writerly conception to the hands of its readers, with each node on its journey represented by women who worked or works at each point. In this focus on the book, I was able to tap into the idea of the book as an object, and to also guide the audience to an appreciation of the kinds of work that goes into making a book. And I think it's really important to note here that it's far easier to represent the kinds of activities that are physically manifest in bookmaking, like writing, illustrating, binding, and even selling, than it is to represent activities like editing, proofreading, design, and advertising, for example, although advertising is also a little bit easier when we think about historic newspapers or even digital advertising today. So really what we're seeing in the collection, in the exhibition, is the fact that I was limited by the structure of the exhibition itself and the need to create something visual for exhibition. But really, my desire to help an audience to think about the book as a physical object meant that the book became the focus of the exhibition instead of the women, in such a way that I think the exhibition began to perpetuate what Leslie Howsam noted in her article, In My View, Women and Book History, as a tendency in book history research to be noticing women at work in the field without theorising the ways in which their gender impacted their experience or capacity to be working in the book trade. As Trish Travis argues in her article, The Women in Print Movement, History and Implications, and I quote, "Talk about women is not necessarily talk about gender as a form of power that structures and delimits experience." So I discovered this tendency in pen to press as I was putting it together, and I think it's a natural tension between the kinds of things that I wanted the exhibition to be able to do. And while I didn't, I mean, they both have equal value for me in terms of what I did want out of the exhibition, people to think about books as objects, but also to think about women and women's experiences in the book trade. And I cast around for looking for ways to build some kind of analysis of women's gendered experience working in the book trade in the exhibition. And I actually discovered that some women I featured had considered their own experiences through a critical lens. In these cases, I was able to incorporate some feminist analysis using the women's own voices. It was perhaps not as elegant a solution to my problem as stringing my own analytical thread through the exhibition text, but nonetheless achieved my purpose by encouraging viewers to consider the implications of gender on women's experiences in the book trade. And I do actually also think that this approach perhaps made the exhibition more accessible by encouraging viewers to make their own connections between the women, their work, and the kinds of pressures they were encountering as they worked. And also, like, I mean, I hope it worked because it's just suggestive, really, but also kind of turned the exhibition a little bit further into an object-based learning experience for people making those analytical connections for themselves. So much for why I did it. Which women did I discover and who did I choose to feature and why? The exhibition features fiction writers Dymphna Cusack and Elizabeth Harrower, both of whom have ties to Newcastle. And I did try to select women with connections to this region, not only because our collection, the special collections collection focus really is this region and you know, collecting and conserving this region's history. Harrower was born here and Cusack lived here during the Second World War. I also featured poets Mary Gilmore and Romaine Moreton, and I could have produced the entire exhibition based on women writers, Australian women writers that we hold in the Rare Book collection. But as I said, I really wanted people to start thinking about the book as an object, and so I wanted to also feature people who had been working on the book as an object, not just creating what you read on the inside. So I included illustrators like Ida Rental Outhwaite, who some of you might be aware of. She was an illustrator for children's books at the turn of the century, the 20th century. And sisters Harriet and Helena Scott. The Scott sisters lived on Ash Island, which is now part of Kooragang Island. I also featured a printer, Louisa Lawson, mother of Henry Lawson, bookseller Bertha McNamara, bookbinder Margaret Chapman, with whom I am now very obsessed. She's an incredibly interesting person to me. And librarian and reader Margaret or Margie India, who is also from the local region. Each of these women experienced different challenges in their capacity to access cultural capital. And I don't know, I was hoping from this talk that I would actually have time and space to kind of unpack what these challenges really were for them in the way that I wasn't able to do in the exhibition, but I'm not going to have time. So I thought what I might do is actually just talk about a couple of them and the way that the quotation that I used in the exhibition kind of tried to blow open those challenges that they encountered or continue to encounter. I do keep using the past tense, but not all of these women have stopped working. So the first person I wanted to talk about was actually Romaine Moreton. who I had never actually come across before this exhibition, and I'm very grateful to have done so. She is an internationally recognised performance poet, writer and screenwriter. And she's a Goanpul Yagarabul Minjangbul Banjalam person from Charanjuri. I apologise, I have not pronounced those as they should be, or Stradbroke Island. Her poetry speaks to First Nations experiences in Australia and across the world, and it seeks to understand colonisation to counteract its negative impacts. She lives in Sydney, well actually I think she lives in the Blue Mountains, but she works in Sydney. In 2011 she published Poems from a Homeland. The collection's bilingual with poems appearing in English and in German translation. And I featured her poem Follow the Sun in the exhibition, and it's a really beautiful, moving piece. It's an optimistic kind of call for First Nations people to draw strength and courage from ancestors, culture and country. And I wanted to speak about Romaine Moreton because she's a person for whom her identity sits at the nexus point of race, gender, and her access to cultural capital is limited by a number of different things. And actually, she is the only First Nations woman writer who is featured in our collection, which is very unfortunate, and I'm very happy that I am in the position to be able to change that. But it's also that overlay, the reason that she is the only woman writer in the special collections is that overlay between the capacity for people, women in particular, and Indigenous women even more particularly, to access cultural capital, to be able to express themselves and publish work in book form. But then the overlay of the collecting principles that have kind of managed the way that collections have grown to date, and thinking about, and I actually wrote it down and I can't remember. Here we go. And also thinking about the fact that Oodgeroo Nunnacoll, or Kath Walker, was actually the first Aboriginal woman to appear in print, and her first book appeared in 1964. So we're also dealing, for Indigenous writers, we're also dealing with a much shorter history of published works than we are for other writers as well. But what I find really interesting about Romaine is that she's a performance poet as well as being a writer. And the quote that I included in the exhibition for her, I think really speaks to her experiences of Aboriginality, and the way that lived experience can be really challenging for accessing the print world. So I'll read the quote because I do really love it. So she says, and this is from an interview with her in 2003. She says, "All roads lead back to orality. Everything I've tried delivered me back to this place of speaking. And that's a journey in itself, because then you've got to deal with the performance aspect. And I was a writer. I never considered myself a performer or even thought of performing. It was just something that occurred because the word deserves to be given its best chance, and that's back to orality. I do think a lot of Indigenous mob have problems with literature. It's a foreign culture. You actually don't need to write, but you do need to speak about who you are. Speak, believe in your voice." And I thought that was quite a powerful quote to remind people of that, the fact that writing and publishing is a foreign culture for so many First Nations cultures across the world. And I do actually think it's really important to note at this point that the library's collection does a very good job of representing First Nations people in general. The general collection is full of wonderful works by First Nations people, but it's the special collections that's kind of letting itself down because of those the kinds of parameters that we put around rare books and what a rare book actually means, you know, something that's a certain age and it's survived such a long time, so it's therefore precious because there's not very many of them out there anymore. Things that are no longer in print and therefore they become special because they're more difficult to have access to. So when we're talking about, for Indigenous women particularly, when we're talking about books that have been published since 1964, they still haven't got to a point where they're considered rare, so to speak. And how much of the time? Gosh,
You've got a good 10 minutes.
Beautiful. Okay. All right. Well, I think I might also just briefly mention the printer Louisa Lawson, because her experience of being a woman in the book trade is also incredibly interesting, and perhaps a bit more obviously influenced by the structures that kind of inform the book trade than Romaine Moreton. So if you don't know who Louisa Lawson was, and I'm sure that most of us do because she's quite a big figure historically and literarily, she was a poet, writer, newspaper proprietor and Australia's first woman publisher. In 1888, she established the Dawn newspaper, which she printed from her office in George Street, Sydney. The Dawn was a mouthpiece for suffrage-era feminism, and so I am very familiar with the Dawn. It published political editorials alongside household hints, fashion advice, fiction, poetry, etc., as well as reporting on women's activities across the globe. It was an immediate success, and by 1889, Louisa employed a staff of 10 women printers, and I do believe she actually employed exclusively women printers. In September 1889, the New South Wales Typographical Association attempted to force Louisa to dismiss her employees by calling for a boycott of printers' offices that employed women. Louisa's support base was strong, however, and the association's attempts failed. But I do think that's very interesting, the fact that, and in fact, the quote that I included from Louisa, and it's actually from an editorial from the Dawn, and I'll read it quickly. The Trades and Labour Council have issued a circular calling upon all trade associations which are affiliated with them to boycott the printing establishments which give employment to women. A few numerous society men, financially strong and powerful in influence, seek to eject from a reasonable and lawful occupation a few women, numbering altogether less than a dozen. So that was Louisa in 1889. And I do love that, like the really emotive language that comes, you know, that persuasive language she's using. But I do think it's really interesting, or a really interesting example of expectations of women's work and women's place and women's role in society, and how even something that we really think about as supporting and protecting workers, being the New South Wales Typographical Association, and how, you know, that force can be set against people based on their gender. So I feel like I have to hurry up a little bit. Where are we? Okay. So in my last 5 or so minutes, I just to wrap up, I suppose. So ultimately, the exhibition enabled me to surface women who worked in the book trade in Australia with a preference for the Hunter region, who are also represented in the library's rare book collection. So there's that little nexus is quite interesting. However, it did also surface some of the biases that have informed rare book collecting historically, including an overrepresentation of works by and representing the experiences of white men. As I mentioned, I was really keen to include First Nations, queer and disabled representations in pen to press, but I was limited by the rare book's existing holdings. And for older texts, there can often be some obscurity with regards to the creator's sexuality, for example. So that can be quite a difficult space to be working in when we're thinking historically. And other contributors to the book trade whose identities place them at points of praxis on the web of intersectionality, because they're doubly impacted by existing collection biases. Now, the existing collection development policy makes provision for collecting into these underrepresented areas, but my experiences of putting this exhibition together have driven home to me the importance of such provisions in managing collection bias, but also trying to go some way to combating those historical biases. And I think it's going to take a really long time before our archival and our rare book collections kind of do represent the full breadth of people in society, particularly when we think about the way that women's writing, for example, or romance fiction, for example, has been undervalued. It's not been considered in the same vein or to have the same value as literary fiction. I was actually able to collect the works of some Novocastrian women writers and Australian women working in the book trade towards the end of 2023 that I featured in the exhibition, which is very exciting. It's nice, feels good. And the exhibition, the process of putting the exhibition together has actually contributed to that ongoing project I mentioned earlier, the Rare Book Collection Review. And I do want to, excuse me, I keep forgetting to change my slides. There you go, you were supposed to be able to see this beautiful reading woman while I talked about them. And I will just show you, actually, if I can escape from my slides. I'm just going to share my screen with the Rare Book Collection. Okay. So this report is what we've put together so far based on this Rare Book Collection review or analysis that I'm using to try and map the collection to, deepen my understanding of it and then also help me kind of collect strategically into the spaces where it's lacking. And what I think is really interesting about this part of the project, or this outcome of the project. So we used, we had someone working with us towards the end of last year who was a bit more tech savvy than I am, and they used ChatGPT to interrogate the metadata in the catalogue related to the Rare Book collection, which are, really interesting use of that tool. But really what it drove home for me particularly is also how reliant we are on the quality of metadata when we're making these kind of reviews of the collection. So you can see they've broken up the number of books by Dewey Decimal Range, which tells us what subject matter each of these books falls into, and you can see where 800s and 900s are literature and history. So you can see we've got quite a heavy skew to those disciplines or those areas. And our publication dates, you can see that most of our books actually come from a very small window, 1968 to 1971. That's kind of where most of them come from, which I think is also due to the fact, the age of the university as well. And books from each century. So we do have some quite old material sitting in our collection, but as you can see, 20th century is predominant as well. And I hope the next one will be books by decade, also interesting, but what I'm trying to get to is languages, earliest publication date, genders of authors. Now this, I think, is what really shows us how important metadata is. So the breakdown that ChatGPT could work out, so we did use gender estimation based on common English first names. And as you can see, the ChatGPT has identified 168 male authors and 5 female authors. But then, probably most interestingly, 26,552 unidentifiable authors. So that could be the first name of the author is missing, or they've used initials instead, or it's an edited collection and there's multiple authors. So there's all kinds of things going on here. But I'm interested to kind of dive in and investigate this a little bit further, because it is very interesting to me. And then also it doesn't leave space for people whose first names are not, normal traditional English names, so or expected English names. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. Now, just before I finish, there's one last thing that I want to share with you, and I need to find my slides again. I realise we are very, very much at the end. However, I wanted to let you all know that actually our art and special collections framework, which is actually part of our collection development policy, it's currently come around for its regular review. And your input is absolutely welcome. And I'll definitely be diving into popping my own recommendations as well. But you can, it's online and it's open to everybody. It's open to members of the community and as well as people who work at the university in every capacity. So please do jump on and have a bit of a read and start to understand the way that our collections are developed. And the things, the parameters under which I work in terms of growing that collection. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, except to say, if you'd like to come and see the exhibition, it's open until the 21st of June this year. And I'm around, so if you want to talk to me about it, I love to talk about it. But that's me, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I'd like to throw open the floor to questions.
Oh, how about I start?
Yep, leap on in.
Well, first, thanks a lot for that. Of course, I love the exhibition, and I love talking to you about the exhibition. So, of course, I enjoyed your talk as well. What I was interested right from the start is how Romaine Moreton's work, given that it's so recent, how it even got into, is it just in the rare books collection or the special collection? Well, you may not be able to say who donated it, but yeah, that always seemed like, she always seemed so much more recent than everyone else in the collection.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that struck me as well, is that I don't know kind of the how the book ended up in our collection. I think it was published in 2000 and I can't remember its publication date off the top of my head.
Well, it was certainly this millennium.
It definitely was. It definitely was. Yeah, and actually I don't even have it written down here.
Yeah.
But something like 2009, something like that. And whether it was purchased or whether it was donated, I'm not sure. It's a tiny, tiny little pamphlet book. It's really not very big at all. So I do wonder if it's classed as rare because it might have been in a short print run.
Yes.
And however it got here, someone identified it as being a rare book. And it ended up in the collection. But it is only in the rare book collection. It's not actually, there's not a copy that sits in the general collection as well for people to actually take home with them. And I think that's probably because it is so tiny. It wouldn't be able to survive a life as a library book, out there. But yeah, if you want to read it, I'll actually, maybe I'll bring it out this afternoon when you're here and we can have a look. It's a lovely, beautiful, beautiful poem. It's really, really moving. And I find it also really interesting that, because it was published in Germany, and which is also fascinating to me. But it's got the English, you know, Romaine is writing into an English space, which is not, it's a culturally, you know, oppressive space for her. But then it's being translated into German, which just takes the experiences into a whole nother space entirely, which, yeah, it's wonderful. Thanks.
We have a question from Paula online. What do you understand as a rare book, and how do the Scott sisters fit into this? Also, does the collection have poetry, as poets are great self-publishers?
They are great self-publishers. Actually, we have an amazing collection of poetry. Thanks for the question, by the way, Paula. We do. We have some really, really fabulous pieces of poetry, and often, or poetry books, and often they might be rare because they are self-published, and therefore there are not very many copies around in the world. I'm getting myself distracted. Oh, so what's classed as a rare book? So rare books are, sometimes they will be made to be rare. They're kind of, the publishers will produce them with the intention of making them highly valuable. And that might just be because it's a really tiny print run. And often they'll do that if it's related to an author who has prestige in life, or even afterlife, you know, but someone like, I want to say Patrick White, for example, you could easily make a rare book of Patrick White's, one of his works, because he's so well known. And if you produce something with particularly high quality materials and you make it a really limited print run, there's a desire for it and it becomes valuable, and therefore its scarcity makes it rare. Books can also be rare if they are particularly old, if they happen to have survived a very long time. I mean, if hundreds of copies have survived, something isn't necessarily going to become rare. But if, for example, there's only 1 or 2 copies left in the world because the rest of them have been, and actually I'm thinking of an example now, and I can't think of the names, but say, for example, there's a book's published and maybe 5 or 6 copies sell, and then there's a libel case against it, and so all book copies from bookshops are removed from the shelves and a new edition is printed. Then those 5 that have made it out into the world become incredibly valuable and very rare, and then take on that rare status, even if they're very recently published. And actually, I'm thinking about the Harry Potter books as well. You know, even though they're reasonably recent publications, their first editions are very valuable these days, very rare. And anything that's got a mistake in it, which sounds counterintuitive, but say, for example, there's a print run where a page is upside down and it happens to be a particularly popular book or something, then that oddity becomes rare, or helps to make the book rare. And the Scott sisters, they fit in because we have some really beautiful books that they've illustrated. I wish I could remember the names of them off the top of my head. We feature, actually I do have their names here. Australian Lepidoptera and their transformations, and also the Snakes of Australia. So they illustrated these books. And actually, thinking about it, I think sometimes rarity or that consideration of a book being rare can also be manufactured by us, by readers or collectors. If we show a particular interest in something, then it can kind of become rare or become valuable, and the value of things also leans into their rareness. If something's worth $30, it's not necessarily rare. But it's also context as well. So something like the Scott sisters, their connection with this region makes them of particular interest to us. And so, the value that we place on them is greater perhaps than the value that someone in the UK might place on them. And they come in swings and roundabouts. Things go in and out of fashion, like Ida Rental Outhwaite. Her work was really popular. She illustrated children's books with fairies and other lovely things. She was really popular in her lifetime, and then tastes changed and she became less popular and has been more recently rediscovered, and the uptick in interest and therefore value in her books is on the increase. That was very rambling, Paula. I hope I kind of answered some of your questions.
I might jump in with a question if I may. This was really compelling, and the way in which the collection, what you sort of identified in the collection is fascinating. Do you have a sense of how those few works by women ended up in the collection? Were they accidental? Were they uninvited donations? Were they forced upon misogynist librarians? What happened?
What happened? Well, actually, it's a combination of all kinds of things. We've had some librarians in this position who have actively collected into women's fiction, women's books. And also, people who sit across those gender diversity markers. We're also just really lucky that sometimes we have people in the community, like I'm pointing at Jude, she recently donated a book by a woman writer from the local region into a space that's actually we don't have a lot of material, like kind of post-Second World War fiction. Even though I know that it looks like we do, because most things come from the 60s. But so sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's on purpose. Sometimes things, women will have had access to much more cultural capital than you'd necessarily expect. And so, I'm thinking there of Mary Gilmore and her status as a poet means that we're much more likely to pay attention to her as well. So, and also, I suppose in a way, the exhibition is quite narrow in its Australian women involvement in the book trade, and also with a focus on Newcastle where possible. So it does kind of obscure the fact that there are a whole load of other women represented across the collection. It's just smaller than.
Sure. And given your emphasis on the physicality of the book, which I think is wonderful, by the way, I think that's absolutely brilliant, but the library has a really active digitisation project, which I think is great as well. And I'm imagining that at least some of the material from this exhibition, if not the whole exhibition, has been digitised. What does that do for object-based learning when you take it out of the physicality into that online space?
Into the online space, actually, thank you for asking. This is really interesting, actually, because you can do object-based learning in a digital space. Mm-hmm. And at the moment, because the digital space, it's a bit like the book at the beginning of the book, mm-hmm. Our experiences of augmented reality or, viewing an exhibition, but digitally, the interfaces don't work naturally, or we're really aware of the interfaces and our capacity to kind of move objects around digitally in a way that we can't, if something's fragile, you can't pick it up and like spin it around and, So it makes us hyper aware of our like the choreography involved in engaging with material, which when you're in the physical space, you just pick up a book, like it's a natural reaction to a physical object that kind of disguises that process, and your I can't think of the word, but you know, your engagement or your the actual word has eluded me. But the part that you play in meaning making when you're interacting with it. So when I'm thinking about digital exhibitions where you accidentally can move through a wall, which you wouldn't be able to do in real life.
Sure.
And that kind of gives you a sense of object, even though it's not a physical object, if that makes sense. So it is possible to do object-based learning very successfully digitally. It's just a different kind of, you know, brings you different kind of things to mind, but still the same kind of soft skill development.
Fantastic. We've come up to the end of the hour, so I have quite a lot more questions for afterwards. But please join me in thanking Morgan again for absolutely fascinating.
Thanks for coming through.
Just before you go, a quick note that we don't have a paper next week, but we do have a paper the following week. So for those of us at UON in week 13, on Monday the 3rd of June at 5 p.m, and it'll be both online and in person. And our speaker will be friend of the seminar series, David Pritchard, who will present on the children of Athena, the armed forces of democratic Athens. And we hope to see you then.